Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds are eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him.
So last week we witnessed the coronation, didn't we, last weekend? I don't know if you watched it or whether you take refuge from these things and go and do something else. But one of the features of these kind of royal events that are sort of planned and overseen by rulers or monarchy is that they're sort of planned meticulously, aren't they? There's a plan for everything. And then on the day itself, everything's kind of driven to go according to plan. And you can imagine that if someone kind of jumps out of line, there's someone kind of immediately tells them to get back in line, and so that everything sort of goes as far as possible within the control of the ruler, and it's all kind of made to look as seamless and as effortless as possible. And it's striking then, isn't it, in today's Bible story, that the God who speaks into this strange situation really in an Egyptian prison both reveals himself again in the book of Genesis. He's spoken several times, hasn't he? But he reveals himself as the God who's in control of the whole universe. The God whose Pharaoh's, even his decisions about his criminals are in their hands. And yet, so on the one hand he's sovereign, but yet the way that he works is that he's got a servant, Joseph, in the prison. And what we'll see in the story, and what we've seen as we've heard it read, is that the initiative that servant takes is rejected. It's kind of met, at least in the short term, at least for a time, with rejection, with lack of understanding and not being taken further. So a really striking and surprising contrast between the way that earthly kings seek to operate and the way that the sovereign God of the universe operates. And I think that's supposed to make us think, supposed to surprise us, shock us even, make us stop and think. But in the first part of the story, I've tried to summarize it in 2 parts. So I think in the first part of the story, we see God's servant's faithful response to his salvation message. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll try and explain what I mean by that. We see God's servant's faithful response to God's salvation message. So I'll just go back to the text. So you remember the story so far in Joseph. So God's been working through Joseph. We've already seen in Joseph's story that God's spoken to him in a dream. He's given him a dream which suggested to him that he's going to become a ruler. And we've seen that he's been with him. So even last week, as we heard that he's falsely accused, and the week before how he was sold into slavery. We heard last week, didn't we, the big theme, that the Lord was with Joseph through all these terrible and unjust events that happened to him. And so as the story starts in this week's instalment, in verses 1 to 4, we see a couple of prisoners come to join him. We've heard at the end of last week, at the end of chapter 39, he's been put in the royal prison, the place where the people who offend in Buckingham Palace or St James's Palace or maybe Parliament or something, that's the kind of place that they get put. And we're told, aren't we, in verse 5, that each of them has a dream, and that each dream has a meaning of its own. And so the author of the book is telling us, right from the outset, that God is at work here, that each dream has a meaning of its own. This culture that this story happens in is very removed from ours, isn't it? It's very different. It seems from reading this story that in Egyptian spirituality of the time and religion, they expected dreams to have meanings, don't they? Because we see in the next verse that Joseph sees them next morning and they're dejected about it. And Joseph notices this. Why do you look so sad today? We both had dreams, they answered, but there's no one to interpret them. It seems like at the time that's what happened. You had a dream, you expected it was the gods communicating with you in some way. And what you did is you went to a dream interpreter who would tell you what the gods were seeking to communicate with you through the dream. It's very different, isn't it? I guess most people today wouldn't expect a dream to have that kind of interpretation or message. Now, actually, God has spoken in the book of Genesis in dreams many times before. He's spoken to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. He's even spoken to people who aren't part of his people. Think of people like Abimelech. And it feels like in this story that God ordered the situation so that he's speaking. He's sort of spoken in a dream again, but in a way which is going to require Joseph about it. This time, rather than speaking directly in plain words, a kind of symbolic message. And he's using the culture of the time and what they would expect so that they will want someone to tell them what this means. And here is Joseph, that he is placed to give them a message from him. And we see, don't we, in verse 8, that Joseph knows God. And he knows that if a dream has got an interpretation, then God will be able to give it. And so he asks them to tell him their dreams. I don't know if you ever have dreams a bit like this. There's something a bit real, isn't there, about this dream of the vine? It all sort of happens in a rush. There's like suddenly there's branches and then they bud and blossom and ripen all at once, all in a kind of rush. And I don't know, sometimes my dreams are a bit like that. They're all kind of random, aren't they? Time is a bit distorted. It all seems to happen in a bit of a rush, but it feels very realistic, doesn't it? But this is the dream that the cupbearer has of this sort of fast motion picture of the vine just appearing and then him putting the wine's just sort of instantly there, and he's there putting it into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph is able to tell him exactly what it means, or give him an interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days, and within 3 days, Pharaoh is going to free him from the prison, and he's going to be put back in his office once before. We don't really know, do we, how Joseph knew what the interpretation was. It's possible that God had given him the interpretation the same night. We know that if we look at the book of Daniel, for example, that's how God gave Daniel an interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that he gave it to him in a dream as well. It could be, couldn't it, simply that he's been given a gift of prophecy and he feels through the Spirit working in him that he knows that it's a message from God. But either way, he does seem to be very confident, doesn't he, that this is what God is saying. So much so that he then puts this little plea in, doesn't he, in verse 14. When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention to me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. And I think here that what we see is Joseph acting in faith in response to this revelation that God has made to the cupbearer. He knows about God, doesn't he, that he's a God who speaks, and he's a God who's made a promise to him personally that one day he will rule. He knows that he's going to rule over his brothers, or at least he's been given an intimation of that by God in a dream. So he knows that it's not going to end for him in the prison. And so here he sees that perhaps God is setting up through the fact that the cupbearer is going to leave prison in 3 days and that he's going to come to Pharaoh, who's got the power to liberate him. Perhaps this is an opportunity. Perhaps God is setting this up as the way in which he's going to get him out of the prison and towards what he's promised him. And so I think this is really the kind of tension and the kind of nub of the whole story that's kind of set up at this point. We've heard God speak. We've heard him promise this message of salvation to the cupbearer, or salvation of a kind. And we have this kind of move of faith by God's servant Joseph. He trusts what God has said to him in the past, that he will rescue him and help him. And he sees this as a potential God-given opportunity. And he acts in faith. He says to the cupbearer, he makes this plea for him to be released. And so we're thinking from now on in the story, is this going to happen? Is Joseph going to be released? Is now the moment where his life trajectory, which just seems to have been going down and down, slavery, false accusation, unjust imprisonment, is now the time at which God is going to finally start to deliver on the promise that he's given to him? What's going to happen? Well, of course, we've heard the story read, don't we? And it's not. That's not what's going to happen. God's faithful servants, God's servants, so there's the faithful response from Joseph to God's salvation message. But what we see in the rest of the story is actually that it meets with rejection. Now is not the time in which that initiative is going to get anywhere, it seems. And actually, I think that we see that it's rejected in 2 ways in this story, both by the baker in a kind of way, and also by the cupbearer more obviously at the end of the story as he forgets Joseph and doesn't do anything about what Joseph has asked him to do. I think it's fair to say that the baker doesn't really engage with what's happened here with God making himself known through this dream. You see, we see in verse 16, he says, when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given him a favourable interpretation. He's seen that the message that has come for the cupbearer has been a nice message, hasn't it? It's been a good message, something that he wants. So it's at that point that he tells Joseph his dream. And it's a dream about, a very strange dream again, about 3 baskets of bread and birds eating out of the basket. But this time, the message that Joseph comes back with, that God through Joseph comes back with, is much more sobering, isn't it, about what is going to happen to him. We hear, don't we, about this sort of execution that's going to happen in the most gruesome and terrible way. It must have been awful for Joseph to have to share this with him, mustn't it? The temptation must have been there to say something else, I guess, or not to tell him as plainly as he did, and yet he doesn't shrink away from it, because I take it that God knows that the God that he serves is sovereign not just over the good times, over salvation, but he's also sovereign over these kind of acts. We're not told anything about the right or wrongs of these acts, are we, or whether the baker deserves this or not. But we can take from this that God is sovereign even over this gruesome act that the Pharaoh is going to do to his chief baker. But the baker doesn't seem to recognize that. He doesn't seem to know that about God, does it? That as well as being in charge of the good things that happen to us, that he's also sovereign over suffering. God is also in charge of even innocent suffering. If he'd stopped to think about it, I guess, as the baker, he would have seen that in front of his very eyes, wouldn't he? He doesn't seem to have engaged with what Joseph himself says. That here is someone who God is clearly using as his messenger and mouthpiece. And yet, there he is, languishing in a prison in an unjust way. He's suffering as an innocent man. And in fact, of course, we know, don't we, in the gospel message, it's through innocent suffering, in fact, that God works his salvation plan. But it's easy for us to be like the chief baker, isn't it, in terms of how we engage with the God who speaks. It's easy to be interested in it for the good that God promises to do for his people, but it's easy for us to sort of not engage with the fact that God is also in charge of the bad things that happen in life, the suffering, and that in fact that he uses suffering of his servants to achieve his purposes. We can do that, I guess, by just not, if we haven't turned to God, we can do that. We maybe haven't realised that about God at all. But then, even as people who follow God, it's easy, isn't it, to look to God just for the sort of things that we'd like to have from him, but not to acknowledge the fact that also that he does, in his sovereignty and wisdom, also bring hard things upon us. It's easy to be blind to that in other people as well, isn't it? Callous and unsympathetic to the sufferings of our fellow Christians. Because we have an attitude that we just want the favourable things from God. I know that that's a challenge to me. So I think we see that there's a way in which someone has really failed to sort of understand or know the God who has revealed himself in this passage. But then, of course, there's a kind of more obvious way in which the cupbearer fails to do it, isn't it? We're told in the story that things turn out exactly as God through Joseph had said. Pharaoh has a birthday, and he celebrates his birthday by releasing the cupbearer, just as God had said, and by executing the chief baker, again, just as God had said. But we're told in the final sort of resolution of the tension of this story that the cupbearer forgets Joseph and doesn't remember him. It may just have been that he's absent-minded, wouldn't it? Possible. But I take it probably what's meant here is that he just kind of, he'd got his freedom and now he wasn't going to do anything for Joseph. And we can completely understand and sort of identify with that, can't we, I guess? We can very much imagine that having been restored to the comfort of Pharaoh's palace, having got his job of prestige back, that why would he risk that again for sort of taking up the cause of a prisoner like Joseph? That could have put his position at risk, couldn't it? Especially given that he was working for a guy who's as barbaric and as capricious as Pharaoh seems to be in the way that he treats people that he doesn't like. And again, it's easy for us to fall into this way of responding to God's message, isn't it? Maybe we've even seen the truth of it with our own eyes. You see, the cupbearer had seen that for himself, hadn't he? He'd actually seen God's word come true in his own life. He'd seen in an undeniable way the awesome power of God. That God was, he couldn't deny that God was in charge over Pharaoh, that he'd been able to tell him exactly what would happen to him. And yet, it's easy for us perhaps to not want to identify with the servant through whom this message comes to us. The fact that God brings this message to us, often through people whose lives aren't going well. They're not going so well. And supremely, I guess, with Jesus. He's the ultimate example, isn't he, of someone who in many ways seemed to be a failure. But also for those of us that do know Christ, again, we can find ourselves shrinking away from the message of God in this way as well, can't we? It's easy for us at work or wherever we are where we're surrounded by others that don't know God, not to want to put our comfort on the line for the sake of identifying with this message and through the suffering messages that bring it to us. We can very much understand and identify with the way in which this message isn't accepted by the cupbearer, or is at least not acted upon in this story. So I think that's kind of where the story ends then, really. It's quite sort of unresolved. In a way it's resolved, but it's very sort of unsatisfactory, isn't it? That there's a message from God, a clear, unequivocal message, which shows how powerful he is. And there's a faithful response from his servant, acting in line with that. And yet, what we see in the story, at least for this part of it, is that it meets with rejection in a slightly different way, but both the cupbearer and the chief baker haven't really seemed to have understood or know the God who has made himself known yet again through what happens in this story. So what does this mean for all of us here in 21st century London? We're a very long way from ancient Egypt, aren't we? But of course the God who spoke back then is the same God who's God today. He hasn't changed. He's the same God that makes himself known to us today. Of course, the way he makes himself known to us today has changed, hasn't it? So Hebrews 1 verse 1 tells us that in the past God spoke through dreams like this and through prophets, but in these last days he's spoken to us through his Son. But like Joseph, we do have a message from God, don't we? We've got a message for ourselves. We've got a message for everyone about Jesus, spoken to us through his Son, and that message is contained for us in God's Word, the Bible. And we have that message because of Jesus himself. And so I think the kind of most immediate way in which it struck me that this passage helps us know God better is that, in a way, what happens to Joseph in this story prefigures or gives us a pattern of what happens with Jesus, doesn't it? It's kind of like an example of what happens with him. Jesus acted in faith, didn't he? Of course he was God, but he was also a man. He was also someone that needed to trust God. And we know that Jesus did trust God as he went around telling people God's salvation message, and as he walked on earth among us. He looked to God for the results of what he told people about who God is and how that we can know them. And yet we know from the life of Jesus, don't we, that that meant the most incredible suffering for him. We read about that in the Gospels themselves. As we read the Psalms, the scriptures that sort of help us think about the experience of Jesus, or that's one of the things they do, isn't it? Help us think about what it was like for Jesus to follow God. We realize that actually Jesus often met with rejection, incomprehension. And of course, supremely, on the day that Jesus died, it looks like that rejection has been complete, doesn't it? It was even his disciples, the men that had followed him for 3 years, even his closest followers had abandoned him. Of course, many of us will know the Joseph story and will know that what happens in this story isn't the end of the story. And in fact, we can see with hindsight when we look with the whole story that actually what happens in this story isn't just a kind of random dead end, but actually is used by God to set up what will be an even greater salvation plan than just saving Joseph from the prison. And we know, don't we, if we're familiar with the story of Jesus, that the story of Jesus being rejected, of being executed, isn't the end of the story. It's not just a random dead end. That actually, that 3 days later, he rose again. And rather than condemning us, all of us by nature are a bit like the baker or the butler, aren't we? We just want the good things from God and not the bad. Or we're too embarrassed to associate ourselves with God rather than risk our comfort. But rather than condemn us, as we rightly deserve, when Jesus rose from the dead, actually he offered salvation to people like you and to me. That's the wonderful message that we have of the Christian faith, isn't it? The wonder of Jesus, that rather than condemn us and and rightly so for the way that we by nature treat him, actually he forgives us. He offers us grace and a new start. So I think supremely that's what this story helps us with. I think it prefigures Jesus and all that he went through. But I think it also helps us that we would just be really clear that this is the way that God works, the way that our God works, the way that the God that we serve works. You know, he is at the same time the supreme God. And yet, unlike the sort of coronation thing where everything's sort of planned so that everything, you know, looks great and there's no nothing that looks like it's a rejection or something going wrong. Actually, this is the way that the supreme God of the universe works. It's undeniable in this story that God is at work. And yet, as we just think about this particular episode of it, it really just is very, very strange, and yet we are left clear that this is the way that he works. And we need to know that, don't we? Because like Joseph, we are called to faith in the message of God. We've heard the promise of God. We've heard that promise of forgiveness that's available through Christ. We've heard about the fact that if we put our trust in him, that one day he will complete his salvation work in us, that he will take us to the new creation. And yet, for now, we don't yet see that fully, do we? We are called to act in faith. We're called each day, in whatever way it is, to go his way, rather than to follow the way of the world. And that can happen in all sorts of little things, can't it? You know, for me this week, it's been challenged by that Fruit of the Spirit song, just our attitudes. And it's just those little choices, 1,000 choices each day that he calls us to make, isn't it? To act in line with his gospel promise. Rather than just the way that we would otherwise choose to respond, the way that people who don't know him respond. And so that's what he calls us to do on a day-by-day basis. There's a big way in which we put our trust in Jesus, isn't there? But there's a little way in each day that we choose to follow him. And we need to know, don't we, that actually often the way that God works, and particularly we're shown it in this story, that those acts of faith won't meet often with things instantly going right and us being affirmed in doing that. Joseph's act of faith appears to get a sort of slap down, doesn't it, in this story? And we need to know that God knows that, actually. He knows that about our acts of faith. He knows that our trusting him each day we won't necessarily see what the result of it or why we're doing it. I think God gives us passages like this in Joseph, because, like this story, this particular episode in Joseph's life, because he cares about us. He knows that that's hard, isn't it? It's hard to wait for God. It's hard to wait for him to complete his salvation promise. And it's hard to keep acting in faith when what happens as a result often doesn't affirm it, but seems to reject it. And so I think this story would encourage, just as I conclude then, it would encourage us to once again, if we're seeking to follow Jesus today, to fix our eyes on him, wouldn't it? It would encourage us again to think about what happened to Jesus, to think about what it looked like for him to follow God, to think about the fact that his perfect obedience often met with rejection. But also to consider, because our faith is imperfect, isn't it? We stumble and fail so often, but because of Jesus and because of his perfect obedience, and because of the way that God vindicated him and raised him from the dead, that actually our salvation is secure. We suffer today. Our lives often don't make sense today, but if we're trusting in him, we really do have an eternal and secure salvation because of what he's done for us. And so that can motivate us, can't it? I think if we tried to do this on our own, we would just give up, wouldn't we? Trusting in God. It would just be too hard. But actually, because Jesus kept going and because of what he's done for us, it does liberate us, doesn't it, to seek each day, to live those lives of faith in response to his promise, even though they often meet with a time of rejection, as they did for Joseph in this story. So let us consider from this story that God knows about this, He understands what it's like for us to meet with that kind of rejection. He cares about it, and it's not the end of the story. Let me pray in light of that, and then we'll sing in response to what we thought about. So let's bow our heads and pray. Father, we thank you for this story. We thank you that you do show yourself to be the God who rules over the whole world, even the decisions of rulers who don't know you, even the decisions of rulers who do the most terrible things to people. Lord, we thank you that you're in control, but we'll thank you more than that, Lord, that you're a God of salvation. You promised your salvation to Joseph, and you've promised us salvation in Jesus. Lord, you show us through this story that often you've ordered things so that your message gets rejected or misunderstood or ignored or not acted upon. And yet we thank you, Lord, that that's not the end of the story. Thank you that it wasn't the end of the story for Jesus. Thank you for all that he has achieved for us. And so we ask that you would help us to follow him today. Help us to put our trust in him for the first time if we haven't. And if we have put our trust in him, then we ask that this would motivate us to faith in him. Help us to choose each day, Lord, in the little things as well as the big things, to choose to follow him and go his way. And Lord, with the suffering that we experience as we do that, the rejection, not ultimately discourage us, because we know from stories like this that you understand it, that you care about it, and that you want us to keep going in faith, just as Joseph did in this story. And so we ask that you would help us to do that. And we pray it for Jesus' sake and for his glory. Amen.